All right, we'll go back on record in case people versus Brandon Martin, RIF 1506112. Record should reflect Mr. Martin is present with both counsel. The people are present. All members of our jurors and alternates are present. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
Ladies and gentlemen, it came to my attention over the lunch hour that there may be some people outside both the front and perhaps the back of the courthouse, and I'm not sure if which side of the courthouse you're coming in and leaving from. But it came to my attention that there may be some people out there holding signs up. I don't know if they're shouting or saying anything, but in any event, it may or may not be related to our trial. To the extent that you see any placards or signs being held up by anyone that you may or may not identify as being part of this trial, you are obviously to ignore it. It is not evidence, and it is not anything for your consideration. As I will remind you once again, the only thing you are to consider with respect to your ultimate decision in this case comes from the witness stand and the exhibits. That is the evidence, not anything that happens outside of this courtroom. So please keep that in mind. All right, with that said, next witness, Mr. Welborn.
Thank you. The defense calls Alan Abrams.
Remain standing. Face the court. Raise your right hand, please.
You do solemnly state that the evidence you shall give in the matter shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
So help me God.
You seated?
Thank you.
You can remove your mask, but adjust the microphone so we can hear you. Okay.
Okay.
Please state and spell your first and your last name for the record.
Yes, Alan, A-L-A-N, Abrams, A-B-R-A-M-S.
Thank you. You may inquire.
Thank you. Morning, Dr. Abrams.
Good afternoon. And pardon me, just one moment. I brought a stack of records with me. Let me just get them out. Okay, thank you.
Great. You ready, sir?
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Abrams, what is your current occupation?
I mostly work as a psychiatrist, but I'm also licensed by the state of California as an attorney.
How long have you been a psychiatrist?
I've been a psychiatrist for roughly 50 years.
That's 50?
Just about 50. I've been licensed as a psychiatrist, as a medical doctor for 45 years.
Can you please tell the jury what your qualifications are that qualify you to be a psychiatrist?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I attended the University of Rochester in New York, where I graduated in 1970 with high honors in psychology and Phi Beta Kappa. I then attended the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine and graduated with my medical degree in 1974. I did an internship in medicine and psychiatry at UCLA Harbor General Hospital, which I completed in 1975. I did a 4-year psychiatric training which was referred to as a residency, and a 1-year fellowship in psychopharmacology at UCSD Department of Psychiatry. Psychopharmacology, if you're not familiar with the term, has to do with how molecules and atoms and other compounds, both internal and external, affect the functioning of the brain and behavior. I've been in private practice of psychiatry since 1979. I am board certified in general psychiatry, in addiction psychiatry, in forensic psychiatry, and in addiction medicine. I am on the faculty at the University of California, San Diego, where I direct the residency training in forensic psychiatry.
How long have you been on staff at UCSD?
Since 1979.
Over 40 years.
Yes.
And I think you told us you're also an attorney. Is that right?
I'm also an attorney. I graduated from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law in 1992.
Do you currently practice law?
I do.
What types of law do you practice?
Whatever my friends and family need.
That sounds familiar. So you've been in private practice for over 40 years, is that correct?
That's correct.
Have you always been in private practice, or have you worked at other facilities?
Yes, I've always been in private practice, but I've worked for quite a number of primarily governmental facilities. I used to work for Riverside County in the conservator's office. I've worked in San Diego in the emergency psychiatric hospital, in the jails. I've worked for many years in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, where I was the chief psychiatrist at 2 of the prisons, one in Imperial County and the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. I retired from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation in 2012. I also had a position with Georgetown University and the District of Columbia back east to create a training program fellowship in forensic psychiatry.
Are you still a staff psychiatrist for the San Diego County Psychiatric Hospital?
No, they needed a full-time commitment, and I didn't have that time.
And in private practice, do you regularly see patients at this point?
Yes, I still see patients regularly.
Is that on a daily or weekly basis?
I have a private practice where I see patients, and I also see patients at the UCSD free clinic where I supervise a number of medical students.
Have you ever testified in court before?
Yes, many times.
Okay, can you give us just a rough estimate of how many times?
Oh, gosh, that's a little difficult. I would guess maybe 400 times. I testify typically in about 10 cases a year, and I've been doing this about 40 or 45 years.
What types of cases do you testify in court about?
I testify in criminal cases, in quasi-criminal cases, which have to do with civil commitments, but of a criminal nature, in many different types of civil cases, both for plaintiffs and defendants.
And you testify as an expert in those cases?
Yes.
Okay. And are you, obviously you're here today because I'm asking you to be a witness, the defense. Do you also testify for the prosecution?
Yes. And for the Department of Justice, both California and the United States Department of Justice.
And you're being paid to testify, is that right?
I'm being paid for all my time working on Mr. Martin's case, yes.
What is your rate?
My rate is $500 an hour, but for appointed public defender cases, it's $350 an hour.
And does the rate change based on what your findings are?
No. The rate is established at the beginning of the case, whether a discounted rate or a non-discounted rate, and people have to live with my opinion.
How many hours have you spent, do you have invested in this case so far?
I have 45 hours invested in this case so far.
And since you just got here, those hours would be in investigation of the files and information contained in the case?
Exactly, and also I attempted to see your client on 3 separate occasions.
Have you also been watching the live stream of this trial?
I have, yes.
And you've been watching the witnesses that have testified in the penalty phase?
Yes.
You said you tried to see Mr. Martin 3 separate times.
Yes.
And of those 3 times, were you ever successful in speaking to Mr. Martin?
No, I was not.
Why not?
He told the deputies that he did not want to see me. I think on 2 occasions he used foul language that the deputies relayed to me. I did not have a court order to force Mr. Martin to talk with me, so I never got to talk with him.
Going back to the testimony that you reviewed, you've had a chance to review the testimony of Sean Martin, Dr. Valcu, Amy Arias, and Dr. Rosario?
Yes, I not only listened online, but reviewed the transcript of their testimony.
Have you also reviewed some documents in this case?
A very large number of documents, yes. And those totaled about 5,000 pages. The most important documents to me were, of course, from the many mental health evaluations or treatment of Mr. Martin, both before and after the crime. Before the crime, he had seen Dr. Valcu, who testified, and I'm happy to say more about her work. He had records with a Dr. Soliman at, I believe, UCLA. He saw a Dr. David Steinberger, a Dr. Robert Solomon, and then he saw 2 psychiatrists at the emergency treatment center slightly before the crime, and then he has seen a large number of clinical therapists, jail mental health clinicians, and jail psychiatrists between September 2015 and the present.
Despite the fact you've never spoken with Mr. Martin, do you believe that you can offer us accurate opinions about this case?
Yes, that's very common in psychiatry where, for instance, in a civil case, a person commits suicide and there are issues about what the person's mental state was, what their mental illness may or may not have been. These are often called psychological autopsies or simply psychiatric evaluations, and I do this regularly in my practice.
What is your opinion about the course and nature of Brandon Martin's mental health since at least 2013?
It's my best opinion from all the records I have reviewed that beginning in late 2012, Mr. Martin began to experience the early signs of schizophrenia, which is quite typical that males during late adolescence or in their 20s are most subject to become ill with schizophrenia. That his parents quickly recognized something was amiss with their son and took him to see a Dr. Valku in January of 2013. Dr. Valku was able to perform a, to my mind, one of the better examinations on Mr. Martin, which may reflect that Mr. Martin was not nearly as ill as it appears he has become. He was somewhat open with Dr. Valku, and she assessed him with many of the symptoms of schizophrenia and made a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia in January 2013. She prescribed a medication that can be helpful in schizophrenia called Abilify, starting at 5 milligrams, raising him to 10 milligrams, which by the accounts of both Mr. Martin and his parents had suppressed many of the symptoms of his schizophrenia, but because Mr. Martin had, had hopes of still playing baseball, he discontinued the medications and then was terminated because his symptoms re-emerged while he was playing baseball. He got fired, and Mr. Martin then saw a number of doctors who he would not be particularly open with. He was guarded. He was suspicious, common in schizophrenia, especially if there are paranoid elements, and has been diagnosed at the jail by multiple clinicians as suffering from either schizophrenia or a psychotic disorder. And the records and his behaviors documented in the records are all extremely consistent with the course of the very severe mental illness that we call schizophrenia.
Is it common for someone that suffers from schizophrenia to get progressively more sick as time goes on?
Yes, and we're talking about unmedicated, because Mr. Martin has not been medicated for reasons I'm not quite clear about. The worsening of the illness is strongly associated with the delay from onset to the beginning of treatment. It appears it's been about 7 or 8 years that Mr. Martin has gone without treatment. So it is no surprise that his illness has gotten worse and worse. Schizophrenia as an illness can get worse in different ways, but the most common way it gets worse and worse is through the development and amplification of what are called negative symptoms. So when we deal with the brain, we talk about positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms in schizophrenia are what seems to happen because the brain is pumping out too much dopamine or other adrenergic-like internal transmitters, and so people become agitated, aggressive, have hallucinations, have vivid delusions, think people can read their mind, think they have special powers, etc. The negative symptoms, on the other hand, have to do with the brain cells and brain circuitry dying. So people with chronic schizophrenia have absence symptoms, like they lose the ability to experience pleasure spontaneously. They lose their sense of initiative. People observe them as expressionless, or they have many fewer body gestures to illustrate their speech. Their speech becomes impoverished, speaking monotones or short sentences which tend to be concrete and not very informative. Their thinking becomes impoverished. They may be able to talk about something very immediate and concrete in their environment, but with little ability to talk about abstract concepts. They lose their interest in socializing. They become quite withdrawn. Being with other people no longer seems interesting. They become often apathetic, with little energy to initiate any parts of their life. While not exactly a negative symptom, but associated with the negative symptoms, is a reversal of the diurnal cycle, meaning a preference for sleeping during the day and being awake at night. And most of us think this has to do with reducing sensory input.
The negative symptoms that you just described, have you heard some of the witnesses testify to some of those symptoms?
Oh, yes. And they are very amply documented in the records of the jail mental health team. And many times they respond that his schizophrenia is dominantly negative symptoms.
So it's your testimony today that you believe that Mr. Martin suffers from schizophrenia?
I think he has a very severe case of schizophrenia that absolutely needs treatment.
Are all mental illnesses the same or similar?
There are a huge number of mental illnesses that range from what seem hardly impairing, such as nicotine use disorder or caffeine use disorder to the most severe, which would be bipolar 1 disorder and schizophrenia, where people, unless they are blessed by God, rarely can function outside some sort of institution.
Would it be fair to say that some of these mental illnesses are more disabling than others?
Yes, absolutely. And I think most people view schizophrenia and bipolar 1 disorder as the most costly of the disabling mental disorders.
Outside of a courtroom, mental illness is portrayed in movies and television and other media. Is that generally accurate, the portrayals?
It's very rarely accurate. Even for the most talented actors and actresses, it's quite hard to show mental illness in its awfulness through acting. So we have a show that was quite popular, Silver Lining Playbook, where an actor is trying to demonstrate what it's like to have bipolar disorder, and it's nowhere close. I think the closest that I tell my students is the performance of Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver. But even with Robert De Niro's skills, even at the end, he's much more coherent than you would have predicted when he's talking to himself in the mirror and on his paranoid task.
Does every person that suffers from schizophrenia have the same symptoms?
No, schizophrenia is not in the truest sense an illness, but a syndrome, and that's why the World Health Organization calls it a disorder rather than a disease, because there's a spectrum of symptoms, a spectrum of presentation, a spectrum of causation, when it begins, how severe it is, and we are only at the very earliest stages of understanding all the genetic abnormalities that cause people to hallucinate and to have this personality deterioration, which is quite common, not in everyone, but quite common.
I want to shift gears a little bit. Based on your review and research of the case, do you have a clear understanding of Mr. Martin's history of drug use?
I believe I do. There seems to be a very consistent self-report by Mr. Martin to many clinicians that he used marijuana on a nearly daily basis up to the time of his arrest. There seems to be a very common statement by Mr. Martin that he used LSD on 2 occasions, that he used cocaine on very rare occasions, that he used mushrooms once or twice. He has consistently denied using methamphetamine. I did not see any recording of whether he ever used PCP, commonly called angel dust, and there was no indication that he ever used volatiles. volatiles meaning things like carbon tetrachloride or paint or glue, the kinds of things that adolescents sniff. He has taken Vicodin after his trying to evade the police and jumping out of a window and fracturing his skull.
When do you believe the last time he used any illicit or intoxicating drugs is?
I don't really know. It surprised me that at the ETS facility that they did no sort of drug screening. It appears that when Mr. Martin spoke to the detectives, I believe the detective's name was Dieterdorf, at the jail. I may have that. Friederdorf. Okay.
Do you have a spelling on that one?
I can't remember.
Okay.
But that they drew a vial of blood, but I couldn't find whether there was any testing on that vial of blood. I would guess that Mr. Martin was using marijuana up until the time he was taken by the police to the emergency treatment service on September 15th, 2015. I have no knowledge whether he may have used marijuana at the time of the killings on September 17th or not.
Let me ask you a few questions about ETS. You said it surprised you that there was not a drug screening done of Mr. Martin when he was taken on that 5150 hold. Why is that surprising?
Well, in all the emergency rooms I've worked in or acute treatment facilities, that's one of the things you want to know. Is the person intoxicated? Do you have to treat their intoxication? Are they going to go into drug withdrawal? And might drug use have something to do with the reason they're in the hospital? But I didn't see that done.
Do you agree with the assessments, diagnoses, and treatment that was provided to Mr. Martin at ETS?
No, I thought it was very perfunctory and minimal, and for reasons I don't understand, many things were not investigated, and because Mr. Martin was good at hiding his symptoms, they took him at face value, but there were many red flags that should have been thought about.
Such as?
His acknowledging hallucinations, his guardedness, the account of him attempting to strangle his mother, the many instances of his violence toward his family members at home, the restraining order his family got against him in recent months, and also the fact that someone had put him on antipsychotic medication with no attempt to find out, in this case, that Dr. Valku had very good documentation of Mr. Martin suffering from schizophrenia.
In your review of the ETS records, did you see any indication that any doctor or staff member from ETS tried to contact Dr. Valku?
No, I did not see any, nor try to contact the pharmacy to find out who prescribed the Abilify, nor contact Mrs. Martin to find out what she could offer in terms of Mr. Martin's treatment with Dr. Valku.
And are those methods you just described pretty common if you're the reviewing doctor?
My practice when I work in the San Diego ETS, and I stopped working there about 2 years ago, was really if somebody's parents called the police, that I knew something was horribly wrong. Parents don't call the police on their children. They do everything possible to avoid that. And that is a huge red flag in itself. And then I consider it an emergency that has to be understood, because the victims of schizophrenic violence are most often family members. And if I heard Mr. So-and-so was on Abilify, Mr. So-and-so stays in his room, he's asleep during the day, he's awake at night, he talks about family members talking in his head, I would be terrified. I would be thinking, I'm applying to the court for emergency medication.
What does that mean?
Well, California has laws that are very generous to the rights of the mentally ill, restricting doctors from unnecessarily medicating people without cause. So in California, often when you have a patient who doesn't believe they're mentally ill, is violent at home, is unable to take care of themselves, you have to apply to the court for a writ, which is often called a Reese hearing and a Reese petition, where you allege that because the person doesn't understand they have a severe illness and doesn't understand the importance of treatment, that the court can order them treated against their will. And then there are many other legal proceedings in California to medicate people against their will when the court believes it is necessary.
Do you agree with ETS's decision to release Brandon from the 5150 hold early, 41 hours?
I am astonished by that, particularly given my understanding that the parents, at the moment that Brandon was being released, were establishing a security system to protect themselves from Brandon. And I was a bit amazed that the ETS clinicians took the attitude, well, if you go home and kill your parents, it's not on us. We're just giving you a bus pass to go anywhere you like.
There was some treatment options that were explained to Brandon through ETS, correct?
Yes.
What were those options?
That he could go to the clinic in, I believe, 4 or 5 days. The ETS gave Mr. Martin medication that typically takes a month to work if the diagnosis were correct and those were proper medications. But since the diagnosis was incorrect, those medications weren't going to help, but typically a medication like Lexapro or Celexa, which are antidepressants, take at the earliest 2 weeks to work, most commonly 3 or 4 weeks to work. Depakote similarly takes about a month to work and is primarily effective in preventing future mood instability, though it can help modify a person's mood in several weeks.
What would have been effective treatment for Brandon?
Well, since he got better on Abilify in 2013, I would have thought the clinicians would have looked into this and either contacted the pharmacy and then gotten the prescriber's name, Dr. Valcoux, or spoken with Mr. Martin's family about were the medications from Dr. Valcoux effective. I'm certain that they could have given Mr. Martin an injection of any of a large number of very safe antipsychotics that would have controlled the worst symptoms of his schizophrenia.
Have you ever heard the term 5250 hold?
Yes. So California, to protect the rights of patients and balance the rights of patients against the needs of society, has a multi-tiered approach. There's what's called the 5150, which is applicable for 72 hours and is essentially non-appealable. You can file a writ for habeas, but the court can't schedule a writ for habeas within 72 hours. So it's essentially a complaint is made, the police determine if the complaint appears valid, the doctor at the hospital reviews the police work and the other information, and then can put the person on the 72-hour 5150 hold. If a person is still dangerous to themselves or others, or gravely disabled, meaning they can't take care of themselves sufficient to survive, then they can be held for another 14 days. And then there are other measures such as applying for a temporary conservatorship or applying for a permanent conservatorship, a 5350, which lasts for a year.
So these are ways that Brandon could have been kept in the hospital for a longer period of time.
Absolutely.
And do you think that would be the correct, treatment plan based on what you've reviewed in this case?
I personally think doctors need to be more than superficial in evaluating a person's dangerousness. The history that I've read from Mr. Martin's mother about many holes in the wall, throwing things, brandishing sharp weapons, multiple physical assaults on family members, a restraining order. I certainly would have wanted to know about that, along with not accepting a person's denial of illness, because denial of illness is one of the best predictors of the severity of illness. And in my work, I rarely have seen somebody with chronic schizophrenia who is willing to say anything more than, I'm normal, it's my mother who's crazy. And that's exactly what Mr. Martin told the people at ETS.
So the person that thinks they don't have an illness is the person that has it.
Yes, when I used to have to screen buses at the prison, I would often ask people who thinks they have mental illness, and everybody would raise their hands because everybody wants to be classified as mentally ill, because then you can get drugs that you can trade with other inmates for commissary or whatever. Prisons are complicated societies, but it's the ones who didn't raise their hand that I wanted to talk to. Because those were the ones I was worried about.
You mentioned earlier that you believe that Mr. Martin was and I don't want to misquote you, but a chronic marijuana user?
Yes.
Do you believe that he was intoxicated when he committed the 3 murders in this case?
I have no way of knowing. There was a blood test done when the senior detective interviewed Mr. Martin, and that would maybe be helpful, maybe not. The toxicology of abusable drugs is very complicated, especially from a blood sample rather than a hair sample or a urine sample. But you can measure the ratio of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the alcohol entity, against the ester or the acid version of the molecule to get a sense of when the last time a person may have used marijuana, because just screened for THC and related molecules can be positive up to 3 or 4 weeks after last use, particularly in a chronic user, because they store the marijuana in the fat cells and other tissue. So what you would look for is the tetrahydrocannabinol vastly predominating over the acid version of tetrahydrocannabinoid. Anyway, you could get a sense of when the last use was, and you can do that with a urine sample quite easily.
Staying on the topic of cannabis, is there any scientific information on the relationship between cannabis and mental illness?
Yes. I could say a couple things and then talk about how many more studies are needed. Many mentally ill people abuse cannabis. And many mentally ill people also abuse other drugs. People who smoke ultra-potent marijuana preparations appear to have an earlier onset of psychosis or schizophrenia than people who smoke lower potency preparations. People who are highly genetically predisposed to become schizophrenic can have psychotic symptoms precipitated by using marijuana. So I can tell you what I make of the scientific literature is that if you have genes that are abnormal and associated with schizophrenia or other mental illnesses, the use of marijuana will accelerate the time when you develop the actual interest, the actual illness. So if you were destined by your genetic makeup to become schizophrenic at 23, using marijuana might mean you become schizophrenic at 20.
So it sounds like it accelerates something that might occur anyway.
That's our best belief. And obviously, we know so little that we cannot say from any studies whether cannabis or marijuana causes schizophrenia in a person with perfect genes. We just don't know. On the other hand, in contrast, we know that if you give any person, whatever their genetic makeup, enough methamphetamine, they will develop a psychosis almost identical to schizophrenia, but not schizophrenia. Everyone will develop it if they take enough methamphetamine. So we have no doubt that methamphetamine absolutely causes a psychotic mental illness, which may or may not persist for the entirety of a person's life. Someone once did a very unethical experiment to see could they make everybody psychotic with enough methamphetamine, and yes, they did.
Do you believe that cannabis caused Brandon Martin's mental illness?
I don't think it helped it. But what we understand is it may have made Mr. Martin become ill earlier than otherwise he was fated to become.
What about the use of these other drugs that were mentioned in the trial and you've also seen in the notes? Would those have caused mental illness?
Yes. So, for instance, LSD, and again, we don't know much about LSD, which we view very similar to cannabis in the uncertainty of causation of mental illness. But people who become mentally ill after using LSD typically develop immediate positive symptoms of psychosis, persisting hallucinations, persisting distortions of vision and hearing, and may then go on to have chronic delusions and hallucinations. But we don't know the issue of causation. A drug like cocaine, which has some similarity to methamphetamine, but many significant differences in how it affects the brain, can at times cause what's called a cocaine psychosis, which typically consists of hallucinations and delusions of parasites or insects crawling under the skin, perhaps auditory hallucinations, but it's very short-lived. Mr. Martin and his friends seemed strong in denying that he used methamphetamine on a chronic basis. From all the accounts, I doubt that drugs played much of a role in Mr. Martin's illness severity or the crime that we're talking about.
Do you believe that Mr. Martin's, the murders that he committed were caused by his mental illness?
Yes, I see a...
Objection, relevance.
Sustained.
Move to strike.
Any answer is stricken.
Can a mentally ill person experience the same sort of emotions as a person that is not ill?
That's correct. However, there is a blunting of emotional expression. So often when people are seen by clinicians, there's a comment, affect flattened or affect blunted, which means the expression of emotion is not seen. But I certainly believe many people with schizophrenia can feel love and anger and rage and disappointment.
How many individuals with schizophrenia have you worked with or evaluated over your 40-year career?
Oh my gosh. It would be more manageable if you asked how many schizophrenic murderers I've seen over the years, and that would probably be about 200. I've seen very large numbers of schizophrenic people in my practice and working at St. Elizabeth's Hospital and UCSD Hospital, the Veterans Hospital. It's well over 2,000 or 3,000.
And the 200 schizophrenic murderers, those are people you evaluated while working in the jail or prison system?
Or in a situation like this where they were on trial and perhaps raised an insanity defense or some other mitigation defense.
Earlier, you mentioned that mental illness can change over time. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
In this case, looking at the records from 2013, can you explain to us how Brandon's illness has changed over time?
Again, it appears that from Dr. Valcout's assessment in January 2013 to the mental health assessments in 2020 at the jail, that there's been a continuous disintegration of his personality with many more negative symptoms and really commonly noted loss of the ability to take care of himself, to respond to others, to have any interest in responding to others, and to have become horribly withdrawn into himself with occasional outbursts of anger.
Do you believe that the progression of his illness is in any way due to drugs?
No. Marijuana is one of the few drugs that has a low association with violence. Of course, the drug most associated with violence is alcohol, and then the stimulant drugs, and then the opioids associated with violence because of the need to get money to pay for opioids. Marijuana is very low on the list of drugs associated with violence.
You were mentioning Dr. Valcout. Can you tell us what the combination of symptoms were that she documented that made you believe that her diagnosis was accurate?
It appeared that Mr. Martin was willing to share, and his parents were open to share, that he talked about having voices in his head, that he had paranoid thoughts, that his communication skills were impaired and his judgment was impaired. And I believe, though Dr. Valku was not nearly as specific as I would be, put all those symptoms and signs together as early onset schizophrenia.
You mentioned earlier that Brandon has not received treatment for his schizophrenia. Is that correct?
That's correct. As best I could infer from the notes, he took the Abilify between January and February 2013. He maybe took 1 or 2 doses of Depakote, maybe 1 or 2 doses of Celexa in 2015, a number of doses of Trazodone, which is primarily a non-addicting sleep-causing agent, 1 or 2 doses of Zyprexa, antipsychotic in 2015, and that's about it.
You mentioned a number of doctors earlier, and in your review of Mr. Martin's case, is it evident to you that he refuses to cooperate with the doctors?
I haven't counted it up. It looks like in the now almost 5 years and a month that Mr. Martin has been in custody, he's probably refused to talk with the clinicians on all but a dozen occasions. And I believe he's required to be seen by a clinician most every day because he's in various types of housing units.
Do you believe that Brandon Martin can be treated for his schizophrenia?
He had a very positive response to Abilify in 2013. The counterweight is the longer people with schizophrenia go untreated, the worse their illness becomes. So it may require heroic doses and will certainly require an involuntary medication order, which in view of Mr. Martin's history would be a easy writ to obtain from the court.
And if he was treated properly, would that reduce his rage, the delusions, anger, the things you described?
Everything. It unfortunately doesn't do much for the withdrawal and the disintegration of the personality, but the medications are excellent at controlling the positive signs.
You told us earlier that you have knowledge and experience with the California Department of Corrections. Is that right?
Yes, I was chief psychiatrist at 2 of the prisons. I worked in the parole office in their outpatient mental health clinic. The California Medical Facility, CMF, was originally created to treat the most seriously medically and mentally ill patients. It was set up as a psychiatric and medical hospital. And of course, we had many famous mentally ill murderers there.
You understand that we are in the penalty phase of this case?
I do.
You understand there are just 2 choices, life in prison or the death penalty?
Yes, and I don't see that there are any other options with Mr. Martin.
And there aren't. But I have 2 questions for you. First, if he was to be given life, in prison, based on your experience with the CDCR, could Brandon be safely treated in the prison system?
Objection, relevance, improper question.
Overall, you may answer.
Yes, all of the maximum security institutions are mandated by the federal courts to have state-of-the-art mental health treatment facilities. I've been to and knew back when I was at Vacaville, many of the treatment teams at the maximum security facilities, and they were very excellent. It would only require I believe it's a 30-20 petition, the equivalent of a Reese petition in the prisons, to have Mr. Martin involuntarily medicated. And I have no doubt it would be granted, and I believe it would be surprisingly helpful for both Mr. Martin and those that love him.
Let me ask you the other side of the coin. If Mr. Martin is given the death penalty and sent to San Quentin, would he also be treated safely at San Quentin?
Unfortunately not. I've been at San Quentin many times to evaluate death row inmates and for the Department of Justice. And the problem at San Quentin death row is the condemned inmates' attorneys typically get a court order or just tell their client, you can't talk with mental health because they will testify against you. So most of the severely mentally ill people on death row refuse mental health treatment, and their attorneys battle tooth and nail against any petitions to give them involuntary treatment.
Thank you. Nothing further.
All right, Cross.
Thank you. So if I understand you correctly, if he's given death, then the attorneys, they could file a motion or a petition to have their client involuntarily medicated, correct?
I've never seen that. Typically, they file motions to prevent the clinicians that work at San Quentin and work with the condemned inmates to prevent them from any form of interview or treatment.
Why wouldn't the attorneys do that if he was given life without possibility of parole?
Because there tend to be no automatic appeals for people given a non-death related penalty.
That's an automatic appeal though, correct? And you're a lawyer, right?
Yes, I am.
Are you suggesting that somebody that receives LWOP or life without parole, they don't appeal?
Oh, not at all. I just finished a case with the Department of Justice for someone who was given LWOP and appealed 20 years later. So, of course.
Right. So the appellate process is a long-standing process, whether we get death or LWOP, correct?
It's the appellate process is open to everyone who has some basis for an appeal.
Right. So I'm going back to my original question. If you get LWOP and you're still involved in the appellate process, and why would an attorney file a petition to have involuntary medication for their client?
Objection, calls for speculation. Relevant.
Sustained as asked. Sustained. Speculation.
All right, I'll move on. So how many doctors have diagnosed Brandon Martin with schizophrenia besides, well, let me rephrase that. How many doctors that actually saw Brandon Martin diagnosed him with schizophrenia?
I haven't done a count. It's easier to divide it before the crime and after the crime.
So there are doctors that saw him after the crime that diagnosed him with schizophrenia?
Absolutely.
Okay. And who are those doctors?
I can go through my sheet if you would like, and I'm happy to do that. I have all those records right in front of me.
So those are names that you were provided by the defense, is that correct?
No. They were names in the medical records of Mr. Martin that are kept by the jail mental health program.
Okay. So how did you get those records?
They were part of the discovery in this case that Mr. Martin's attorneys provided to me.
All right. So when I asked you if you were provided the names, you were by the defense.
I was provided with the records from the Riverside County Sheriff's Department Medical Department relating to Mr. Martin that have all the mental health visits from, I believe, September 21st, 2015, when he was booked, up to June 2020.
Okay. Again, my question is really simple. So the names that you received is in part of the discovery from the defense, is that correct?
I had to read every page of roughly 3,000 records to find the names. I was not provided with them. That would have been much easier.
Whether they gave you a list of names or it was provided in the discovery, you got the names, right?
From all of the records, I was able to find psychiatrists. And it's not that easy in the records because they don't put credentials, but making inferences, yes, there have been a number of psychiatrists at the jail who have diagnosed Mr. Martin with either schizophrenia or continuous schizophrenia or psychotic disorder.
And those are physicians or therapists, clinicians that saw Mr. Martin and was able to get a history from him, talk to him, or is it just based on the records like what you've just testified to?
It appears that they both observed Mr. Martin, spoke with Mr. Martin, reviewed his records, and came to what seems to be the obvious conclusion.
And those clinicians diagnosed Mr. Martin and then also prescribed medication.
Now, that's interesting because I don't have the unrelated documents from the sheriff, but at least on one occasion, they filed a 4011.6 petition, which is the equivalent of a Reese petition for involuntary medication. But for reasons I do not understand, there's a note that said the court denied the petition.
Okay. So somebody tried to do what you're saying should happen is file a motion to have Mr. Martin involuntarily medicated, but the court evaluated the motion, heard the sides, and they decided not to do it, right?
Yes, and I believe that took place in 2017.
Okay. So what you're suggesting we do with Mr. Martin is just involuntarily medicate him isn't just something we can rubber stamp and then just do. It goes through due process. Would you agree?
Oh, no, the clinicians have to do their work. They have to document, and the law is appropriately better in the prisons than it is in jails or the community, because the law specifically allows in the prison setting for the clinician to include information about past history, whereas on a Reese petition or a 4011.6, the clinician has to show the person is absolutely unable to recognize that they have a disease that needs treatment. I don't know why the difference. I assume the legislature assumed people in prison because of a history of crazy, bad behavior, violent behavior, so prison should have more ability to treat than maybe jails. I don't know.
Okay. But at any rate, he is not on medication, correct?
Not at present, not since 2016.
Okay. And so in the 4 years that he's been not medicated, how has he been?
It appears that he has been quite withdrawn, with occasional outbursts of anger when someone tries to arouse him from his withdrawn state, that his cell is typically described as filthy, and food and feces and whatnot around the cell, that he sleeps on the floor and tells people to go away if they try to talk with him.
Okay, so he was...
And I do note he had an outburst in March of this year when he was in court.
What happened in March?
Apparently he tried to...
Objection calls for speculation.
Well, on that grounds overruled.
Objection 402.
We'll have to take that out. So for now, let's move on without asking that question.
Okay. So he's withdrawn. He gets angry if he's aroused from his sleep. Is that right?
From his stupor.
From his stupor.
Yeah.
He's in jail.
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, Mr. Beecham, we're at break
okay.
anyway, so let's, ladies and gentlemen, take our afternoon recess at this time. Remind all of you not to discuss facts of this case amongst yourselves or with anyone unrelated to the trial, not affirm or express any opinion until you've heard all the evidence. We'll come back at 20 after 3. 20 after 3.
Thank you. Is it possible to get water? Or
Yes.
should I just get it from the water?
I will get it.
Okay.
It's just a big, we have it.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you.
Uh-huh.
No,
So
no.
I'll have it set right there.
Oh, I so appreciate
I'll have
that.
you go and step off right now.
Okay.
When you come back.